I'm Jeff Mankoff. I am the acting director of the Russia and Eurasia program here at CSIS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a discussion and book talk with Dr. Taras Kuzio, who is the author of the new book, Ukraine, Democratization, Corruption, and the New Russian Imperialism. Professor Kuzio is currently at the University of Alberta. He's had a number of academic appointments over the years, including here in Washington, D.C. He's been a frequent commentator both in the popular press and in academic circles on Ukrainian politics, nationalism, developments in Eastern Europe. The book I was reading through, I think the title is a bit of a misnomer. It's about a lot more than democratization, corruption, and the new Russian imperialism. It's a real tour through the last several decades of Ukrainian history, both in and outside of the Soviet Union, with a deep dive into the politics and the culture as well. And Dr. Kuzio is a public intellectual as well as a scholar, has been very much out there talking about and publishing about the current crisis in Ukraine, and we're very excited to have him here. He's got a presentation, I guess we're going to go about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have a conversation up here and open it up for discussion. So please welcome Taras Kuzio.
Thank you. The one thing you know about Ukraine is that there'll always be crisis and there'll always be need for me to give talks. So it'll keep me in business until I'm retired, I guess. The book was, just to give you some background, the one thing that I've come up on, and which will come up in my presentation, is that countries like Ukraine did not begin their independence in 1991 with a clean slate. Now that sounds sort of obvious, but at the same time, many of us maybe were under the misapprehensions, particularly after the Orange Revolution, maybe after the Euromaidan Revolution, that the old guard, the old, would be swept away. But we've seen that legacies, what you inherit, have still a tremendous influence on contemporary events. It takes a long time, if you want to put it in post-colonial terms, for countries to emerge from their colonial and totalitarian past. And in this case, that was the reason why I began the book not in 1991, but in 1953, when Joseph Stalin died, because all of the leaders in that region, the Putins, the Kravchuks, Kuchmas, Poroshenkos, they went through their socialization in the Brezhnev era of stagnation in the 70s and 80s. This was their formative period of political and economic life. And then they became the post-Soviet leaders of the region. And of course, that particular period of time, from sort of the late 60s to late 80s, created, with the decline of the Communist Party, the growth of cynicism, the growth of corruption in the Soviet Union still, that became the backdrop to the 1990s transition to democracy and market economy. So the book's background is really pre-91 and post-91 together, and I think that's what gives it some value. 3 chapters on history and 9 chapters on thematic issues, some of which we'll cover today. Now, how do I guess this, yeah, okay. What I think is good to point out, because we're always talking about sort of questions such as reforms, oligarchs, is that many areas of Ukraine seem to be very fixed. They don't seem to change very much over time. And this is one of the reasons why there's a lot of disgruntlement in society, why often when you see opinion polls, it says you have very high numbers of 50, 60+% of Ukrainians saying the country's not going in the right direction. You have the same kind of rotating elites. It's just basically musical chairs. Petro Poroshenko and Arsen Yatsenyuk are 2 of the biggest flip-floppers in Ukrainian politics, to give you an example. Poroshenko is one of the founders of the party Regions in 2000, 2001. Today, he's a Euromaidan president. You have, throughout that part of the world, disgruntled masses prone, obviously, there to anti-elite populist rhetoric. Not surprising when they usually have a lot of the shock of economic reforms, such as economic and fiscal reforms, but very little of the therapy in terms of, say, anti-corruption policies. You don't have any political parties in Eurasia as such. There's not a single Ukrainian political party. What are termed political parties are just fan clubs for leaders. They're not political parties in the Western political science understanding of that term. And that's as true of Ukraine as it is of pretty much every Eurasian country. This is one of the factors that makes Eurasia, post-Soviet Eurasia, very different to Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, and the Baltic states. But Ukraine is different to Russia and most of Eurasia in that it always has had, since the 80s, a very active civil society. And going back to my book, Ukraine in the Soviet Union had the biggest proportion in terms of the size of the population, the largest proportion of dissident movement, of political prisoners, something up to like 40% of political prisoners in the Gulag were Ukrainian. So that was always there. Partly that's a consequence of geography, that you have a very high concentration of activism in Western and Central Ukraine. National identity and civil society go together. You have a judicial system which, yes, it's under reform today, but to what degree it will be reformed and what a massive job that is. Crime still pays in Ukraine, I would say. The places where people go to jail are in the US and Germany. If you're foolish enough, like Pavel Lazarenko, to seek asylum in the US, then you'll go to jail. If he'd have stayed in Ukraine, he probably could have bought his way out of the problem. Oligarchs, we'll talk about that a bit later, but are they a pretty semi-permanent fixture of the country? I mean, we hear a lot about the need to deal with oligarchs, but we in the West and in Ukraine send mixed signals and confusing signals about oligarchs. Ukraine's economic growth has always been stymied by the corrupt situation in the country and very poor economic and government policies. Everybody compares, for example, Poland and Ukraine, which had about the same GDP in 1991. Today, Poland has 3 times the size of Ukraine's GDP. The Ukrainian economy is still slightly below the size of the Soviet Ukrainian economy of 1989. It's growing, but you still have a relatively small middle class, which is a reflection of that size of that economy. The shadow economy it's not something that's going up and down. It's pretty much fixed. It's been like that since the mid-90s. So when you have a situation for 20 years of a shadow economy, which is 40 to 50% of GDP, that's pretty much a fixed feature of the country. And one of the reasons why it's very difficult for Western economists to understand why is everybody not suffering in the economic crises? Because there's a large shadow economy. People often get paid in cash. They have their own sources of income. And so reality is very different from official figures. Some of that is, background to that is in the Soviet Union, the growth of a shadow economy in the Brezhnev era. And there's still a lot of trade with the East, but of course that's going down, particularly in terms of the energy sector. What does it mean about, we talk a lot in the West about reforms. What is this term? We have to dissect this term. Because there's an assumption that because lots of people go onto the Maidan, Orange Revolution, Euromaidan, does this mean that they're all in favor of reforms? Well, no. In Eastern Europe, that was also the case, Central Eastern Europe. Some reforms the public like, some reforms the public don't like, particularly when it comes to economic and financial issues. I don't think anybody in this room would like very much if their utility bills went up by 300, 400%. So inevitably, those kind of areas are going to be unpopular. They're required, they're long overdue, but they're going to be unpopular. But the problem is that the balance to that, sort of maybe defanging the oligarchs, fighting high-level corruption, showing examples of people going to jail, if that doesn't happen, then the average Joe in the street feels as though they're the only ones suffering in this economic situation, and that there isn't, it's sort of business as usual with the elites. So if the two were going together, sort of pain on the economic, financial, energy side, but at least some success fighting oligarchs and corruption, then I think that would maybe be some kind of trade-off, but that's not happening. That inevitably is going to be something that Poroshenko will have to deal with down the road. And as this cartoon shows, we're back to the same problem of it's always somebody else's fault. Poroshenko blames Yatsenyuk, Yatsenyuk blames Poroshenko. Under the two Ukrainian constitutions, we've had parliamentary, presidential. The prosecutor's office, the security service come under the presidential domain. And so Poroshenko's really the one who's responsible for covering those two areas. And he's the one who should be sending a political signal about corruption. But we have a prosecutor's office in Ukraine, which should be closed down, in my view. The biggest organized crime group in Ukraine is the prosecutor's office. Same probably in Russia and many of these other countries. Western governments, US included, have tried with millions and millions of dollars to reform the Soviet institution, where these prosecutors wear uniforms still. There's 20,000 of them. To put that into context, Britain, which has 20 million more people than Ukraine, has 8,000. Ukraine has 20,000. If you disbanded this organization, there would be zero impact on the fighting corruption, because they're part of the problem, not a solution to the problem. They're incompetent, they're inefficient, and if you want to have a test for any Ukrainian leader coming in about their determination to fight corruption, see what they're doing about the prosecutor's office. If they come in and don't disband it, you should already get worried. If they come in and appoint incompetent heads of the prosecutor's office, then you should be really worried. Poroshenko's appointed two very incompetent heads of the prosecutor's office, so you have a useless institution with very incompetent appointments. That's not going to produce results in the fight against corruption. And we saw that just a week ago. I think it was US Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, gave a very damning indictment of Ukraine's prosecutor's office in a speech he gave in Odessa. Coupled with that, you have security service, which also is heavily overmanned, something in the region of at least about 5 times as big as the British combined MI5, MI6. And also an institution which is politically driven in terms of dealing with corruption. Often it's investigative journalists who bring out corruption amongst politicians before the security service even gets to it. Ministry of Interior is now in the process of being reformed with American assistance, transformed from a militia to a polizia, to a police force, but that will take time. And the biggest problem is going to be something similar to what we had in Georgia. Ministry of Interior of Ukraine is 300,000 people. Again, to put that into context, Britain has 120,000 police and prison officers for a country 20 million bigger than Ukraine. So a lot of people are going to be unemployed if you start to reform the Ministry of Interior. Those unemployed police officers, like in Georgia, are potential agents of counter-revolution down the road. And that has to be factored in. What about oligarchs? We hear a lot as well in the West about the need to deal with oligarchs. And I've been hearing this for at least over a decade since the Orange Revolution. But even oligarch watchers in this city send very confusing signals about what to do. And one of those, for example, is Anders Asland. Writes great books about Ukraine, but I'm still confused as to what he wants to do about oligarchs. Do we put them in jail? Do we forcibly take away their television stations? Do we renationalize their assets? Do we make them pay? When Russia's put people in jail who are oligarchs, we've had outcries in the West that this is an infringement of human rights. Hodorkovsky, for example. So what do we actually want to do about these oligarchs? And how do we deal with probably one of the biggest problems that we have in terms of democracy in Ukraine is their control of television. Do we forcibly take away their television stations? Because that has a major impact upon public opinion, and the fact that all the main channels are controlled by oligarchic groups. Another factor we have is that oligarchs can get away with a lot is because they buy up people in the West, particularly in Western Europe, but not only. They were also successful in buying up some people in this city. Some very high-ranking former advisors to presidents, former heads of National Endowment for Democracy, worked for Yanukovych when he was in power for various front organizations. This is less of a problem, I think, than in Western Europe, but if money is to be stolen in Ukraine and Russia, that money has to go somewhere, and it tends to go to Western European countries. We all know them, which they are, and they're offshore tax-free havens. So the corruption problem is a problem on both sides. And whenever I've raised this aspect of it in front of European Union officials, all they do is look at the floor in shame. Because the European Union as an organization tells and probably pays, sends grants over to fight corruption in Ukraine, and individual EU member states benefit from that corruption. There is a reason why London is nicknamed Londongrad, or Moscow on the Thames. One of the, I would say, not one of, the most successful oligarchic group in Ukraine is not from East Ukraine, where we would think it's from. It's actually West Ukrainian-based. It's one of the areas I think I'm pretty original in this book talking about. Something that we, Ukrainian diaspora tends to think that the corruption problem is an East Ukrainian Donbass problem. Well, actually, the gas lobby are West Ukrainians. Firtash is from Ternopil in Galicia, in West Ukraine. And they've been the most successful in their ability to adapt to whoever new comes to power. They did a deal with Yushchenko in the Orange Revolution, towards the end of the Orange Revolution, just before he was elected. And I've kind of done the chronology of how they were very successful in, despite the Euromaidan revolution, getting their people into power from January to about March. And Firtash himself, who was indicted by the US and the US asked Austria to have him deported to the US to stand trial on corruption, Firtash was successful enough in buying off influence in Austria. And in how he did this, I have no idea. He was able to convince Austrian judges that somehow he was a supporter of the opposition and a supporter of the Euromaidan revolution, which is an incredible miscarriage of justice. 3 people gained the most from the mafia state under Viktor Yanukovych, and they were his son, Alexander Yanukovych, Rinat Akhmetov, and Firtash. They gained the most in terms of insider government contracts and privatizations. How Firtash was able to convince the Austrians that he's somehow a supporter of the opposition is anybody's guess. But there you are. Poroshenko and Klitschko will not go after gas lobby leaders. If you look at the lists of Ukrainians that are sought after by Interpol and by the European Union, which have sanctions and asset freezes, none of the gas lobby leaders are on there. They're able to buy themselves off by buying off a prosecutor general who came in after the Euromaidan. None of their names, Lyovochkin, Boyko, and Firtash are not on those lists. What about the external side? The external side is interesting from the viewpoint that I still, despite all of our expertise, where does Ukraine fit in Europe? And I say this because there's been a massive sea change in public opinion in Ukraine. Not surprising. Throughout history, war and conflict have helped to forge national identities. Think of your Declaration of Independence and the US Civil War. These were very important factors in the formation of the American national identity. Similarly in many other countries, similarly in Ukraine today. Today we have a completely new situation where a majority of Ukrainians for the first time ever support NATO membership and, of course, EU membership, which was always less controversial than NATO. But nevertheless, we also have a very small percentage, less than 10%, in support of CIS integration. So how Putin is going to achieve his objectives in Ukraine today is going to be a pretty impossible task, a pretty difficult task. So the very idea of Ukraine moving eastward is, in my mind, very difficult to see. At the same time, how does Ukraine move westwards when you have so much opposition in Western Europe to EU and NATO enlargement to Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova? So Ukraine, in that sense, is a country that doesn't really yet have a place to go. It has aspirations, has public opinion now in favor, but where does this country go to? Where does it fit in? The EU also gives Ukraine a pretty impossible task to do. And I'm not trying to get the Ukrainians off the hook. I mean, in many ways, the Eastern Partnership developed for 6 former Soviet countries, 3 of which have an interest in it, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine. It's EU enlargement on the cheap. It's EU enlargement light, as some people have described it. These countries have to do a lot of the homework, a lot of the reforms as part of the Copenhagen criteria without the membership carrot. At the same time, they have far worse communist legacies, which my book goes into, which they inherited. They're far worse than the legacies inherited by Central Eastern Europe, and there's far less money given by the EU for these reforms than what they gave to Central Eastern Europe. So this is a very difficult task to do. Add to that a war and bankruptcy that you inherited from Yanukovych. This is not an easy. I would not want to be president or prime minister of Ukraine. And I don't see how that will change very soon in the future. I don't see much willpower in Brussels to throw the membership carrot to Ukraine. They've always been opposed since 1991 in giving membership to countries in the CIS. What about Putin's objectives in Ukraine? I've kind of touched upon these. I think what here is interesting from a scholarly point of view is to what degree Americans who have produced very good books on Putin and Russia. I've just finished reading Fiona Hill's book, which I thought was excellent. But I find that American scholars don't have the European perspective in terms of national identity and interethnic relations, because this is not a topic that's usually taught and researched in American political science. It's more of a European question. And this is one element, I think, which is therefore lacking in, I would say, American analysis of the Putin problem that he has with places like Ukraine. Because what Fiona Hill talks about in her book is how Putin began to change with his speech to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, in 2008 his speech to the NATO summit in Bucharest, his invasion of Georgia, shouting from the rooftops that he wants to be different, that Russia wants to be different, Russians are a different civilization, we don't want to integrate with the West, we don't want to become like you, and the West not hearing that. The West resetting its relations with Russia, the West ignoring what happened in Georgia. And there's a very good article just last week published in Foreign Affairs about how Putin increasingly is reliant on white Russian emigre fascists and nationalists in their ideology, particularly this one, Ivan Ilyin, an white emigre. Why is that a problem? Because those kind of emigre nationalists and fascists always believe that Ukrainians are not a people. Putin repeats that today all the time. Ukrainians and Russians are one people. That has consequences when he says that. It means that Ukrainians have no right to join EU and NATO. They are part of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and they should be looking up to Russia as the elder brother. Sort of that's the kind of nationalities hierarchy of the relationship. And Ukrainians are divided into 2 groups, basically. The ones who believe that, who agree with him, what Ukrainians would condescendingly call little Russians. Many of these live in the Crimea, particularly, and in the Donbass, who have often a very Soviet identity. And Ukrainians who don't, which is a majority. But they're all fascists. And this has a Soviet background, because in the Soviet Union, emigre Ukrainians and opposition dissidents, whether you were a left-winger, a liberal human rights activist in the Helsinki group, or a national communist, or a far-right nationalist, you were all bourgeois nationalists in the Soviet Union. So this draws on the Soviet legacy of attacking Ukrainians who dared to be separate from Russia as somehow agents of the West, fascists, bourgeois nationalists, and Nazi collaborators. Putin would like, therefore, to have his own Kadyrov in charge of Ukraine. He thought he had it with Yanukovych. You know, he did the same tactic. He threw money at Yanukovych. Yanukovych bit the bullet, dropped EU association intentions, and agreed to become Ukraine's Kadyrov. But what this failed to take into account is that Ukraine is not Russia, and that Ukraine has a dynamic civil society and a strong national identity, which is not the same as in Donbass. Ukraine is not Russia, and Donbass is not Ukraine. And so that didn't work out. The plan for a federalized Ukraine is, again, nothing that different. The same kind of plans were proposed by Russia to Moldova in the early part of this decade, or the last decade, sorry. So that is an attempt to create a very weak, failed state scenario, like in Bosnia, which would then be controlled by Ukraine. But the problem, again, with that is that federalism in Ukraine has always had very low support, public support, including in the East. How do you achieve your objectives today in Ukraine if you're Putin, if your policies, annexation of Crimea and war and invasion of East Ukraine, have done the opposite, have turned the public against you? And that is one of the... This is one of the extreme fascist nationalists who Putin were brought out of the margins after 2012 when Putin came back to power. He believed that the protests in Moscow and in Russia were financed by the West. This is the kind of the conspiracy mindset that Yanukovych, Putin have, that these democratic revolutions are all organized in Langley. And people like Dugin, Eurasianists who believe Russia is a separate civilization, became very influential after 2012. And the kind of views that they have are, you either believe that you are part of the Ruski Mir, or you're vermin, you're fascists, you need to be killed. And that kind of hostility was what was broadcast right up until recently, until the Syrian intervention, was broadcast all over the Russian media, and that created a lot of the tension and the conflict and the violence and the human rights abuses. So Putin had objectives. What he did, though, his policies produced the opposite. And this is where I think the frustration is with in Moscow. Because he's looking at Ukraine in the wrong way. He believes that he told President Bush in Bucharest that there are 20 million Russians living in Ukraine, and the whole of southern Ukraine is populated by Russians. Well, he obviously doesn't know Soviet, never mind post-Soviet censuses. If you're a Russian speaker, that does not mean to say you're a Russian, and it certainly doesn't mean to say that you're pro-Putin. And this is what he came up against. The majority of Russian speakers in Ukraine supported Kiev over Putin during the Donbass intervention. So what we have is not a civil war in that sense, I would call it more a civilization conflict, where Ukrainians who have a more Soviet, Eastern Slavic identity, who agree with the Russian worldview, point of view, who believe Ukraine's future is not in the EU, but in that Russian world, they supported the separatists. And those kind of people were only really high in number in the Donbass and Crimea, not in the other 6 regions of so-called New Russia. There was some tension and conflict in Kharkiv and Odessa, which were swing regions, but even there we're talking 10-15% maximum, and that required external intervention. When so-called separatists or so-called local separatists in Kharkiv pretended to be locals, there were Russians pretending to be locals during the spring of last year, they occupied the Opera House in Kharkiv, believing it was the city hall. And to the degree to which these were fake, they were brought in from Russia. So again, it's not a conflict between Ukrainian and Russian speakers. Majority of Russian speakers have supported Kiev, and you get a huge number of Russian speakers in the volunteer battalions, including in the nationalist battalions, by the way. So language isn't the issue that it's been made out to be. So what's Putin achieved then? Well, he's created a Baltic Republic-style frozen conflict in the Crimea. How that will be resolved is difficult to say. Crimea is not a subject of the Minsk agreements. Minsk agreements don't apply to the Crimea. So it's a kind of Western already acquiescence in the Crimea is a finished matter. You get many foolhardy Western commentators, particularly in Europe, I think, who talk about the Crimea as though Crimea's history began in 1783. There's nothing before that. This was always a perennially Russian region. The separatists in Ukraine were on the verge of being defeated in the summer of last year, even by a very ramshackle Ukrainian army and volunteer battalions, so that required Russia's intervention. Today, how do you deal with the fact that 40,000 separatist forces are now bigger than many of the NATO member armies, many member countries' armies? How do you disband that institution? Inside Ukraine itself, support for CIS integration is very low. Putin is viewed negatively by over 75% of Ukrainians, as is the Russian government. This is not the view of Ukrainians of Russians as people. It's a view of Ukrainians of the Russian government and Russian leaders. So they differentiate in public opinion between attitudes to Russians in Russia and attitudes to the Russian government and the leader. And as I mentioned, support for Western integration is a record high. Here, I think one of the major Western policy failures, and Fiona Hill and others go into this today, maybe with hindsight, is the degree to which Western governments let Russia off the hook in 2008. Russia invaded a foreign country, Georgia, and there were hardly any sanctions, if any, against Russia for doing that. And the US new administration under Barack Obama ignored it completely and reset relations with Russia. That led to the mistaken misconception on the part of Russia that Crimea the West would react in the same way, that there wouldn't really be a very major, tough reaction from the West. And I think from the Putin point of view, the biggest shock was Germany's reaction in this. I think we should need to wrap up, don't we? Is reconciliation possible? I'm more sanguine about this. People today talk about that maybe Putin's given up on Ukraine because of Syria and such like. I don't think that's the case. If we take the slides I've talked about in the context of national identity, how Russian nationalists have traditionally and today look upon Ukrainians as not a separate people, that they don't have to write to a separate independent state, that they should be part of the Ruski Mir, they should adopt the Belarusian approach, shall we say. Then that problem, the Ukrainian problem for Putin, is going to be always there. It's going to be sometimes high on the agenda, sometimes not. Although there's been a stand down in the Donbass, at the same time, Russian intelligence services continue to train terrorists to operate in other parts of Ukraine. Every day, those terrorists are captured in various parts of Ukraine, including today. I just saw some new videos. So that is still taking place. So Russia is going to continue that pressure. I don't believe somehow that Putin's given up on his Ukraine project. At the same time, maybe Putin is looking down the road to a repeat of 2010, when we had counter-revolution with the election of Yanukovych. And this goes back to the domestic aspect. This is where it's difficult to understand the Ukrainian leaders for not decapitating the oligarchs, particularly the pro-Russian oligarchs, as being something in their own interests. When Yushchenko didn't do that with the oligarchs, they came back to haunt him in 2010, and they launched a counter-revolution, and we know what happened then. If the same happens today, if nothing happens against the pro-Russian clans and pro-Russian oligarchs in today's Ukraine, they could be also potential counter-revolutionaries and therefore allies of Putin down the road. That could be another objective that Putin is looking for. that he's just waiting and rubbing his hands and saying, sooner or later, we're back to square one anyway, because the West is not exactly opening its arms and saying, come on, join NATO or the EU. So where's Ukraine going to go? So I don't think the Ukraine question will go away soon for Putin, particularly as, I think I skipped this. This question we still have is, we have such weak Western leaders at this moment in time. And it's not just a question of the US, it's Western Europeans. Putin must be extremely happy when he has Hollande and Merkel to deal with. But even in the case of the country I live in for the last sort of 14 years, Canada, the Ukrainians in Canada are tremendously disappointed with Harper because the US has done more in terms of supporting Ukraine militarily, in terms of the US Congress, than the Canadian Parliament. There's been no vote in the Canadian Parliament to support the sending of military equipment to Ukraine, and Prime Minister Harper does not support that. So the Ukrainian lobby in Washington, D.C. is far stronger than the Ukrainian lobby in Ottawa, and that's a new situation in Canada. Maybe Prime Minister Harper is afraid of little green men arriving in the Arctic, because Canada it's one of those strange countries to look at as an outsider like myself, because the way to get a good response in the Canadian crowd is to crack a joke about Americans. At the same time, Canada relies for the US completely on for its economic growth and trade, 85% of trade is with the US, and relies completely on the US for its national security. So you have this kind of paradox with Canada. And Canada's spending on military is one of the lowest in the last 50 years. It's at the bottom 6 countries in NATO in terms of military spending. So there isn't even the military equipment to send to Ukraine. There are 7 countries doing training of Ukrainian forces, the US, Canada, Britain, Poland, Israel, Georgia, and I think there's one other country I've forgotten. They're there. Turkey, that's it. But a lot of this training was already being done prior to the conflict in the NATO Partnership for Peace program. So some of this is not necessarily new. But where I think Putin's running out of time here, and this is where the Syrian gambit may work against him, is that the time to have really invaded Ukraine would have been last spring of 2014. When Ukraine was in chaos, there was no Ukrainian army, literally, and the volunteer battalions had not yet been formed. But he didn't, for whatever reason. He sent in special forces and GRU and FSB agents, but didn't actually send an invasion force in. So the longer he's waited, the more Ukrainians have had time to build up their armed forces, to integrate the volunteer battalions into the National Guard, military, and security service. And with the next US president in 18 months, whether it's Democrat or Republican, I don't think will make a difference. They will be far more in support of the US Congress in sending defensive military equipment to Ukraine, I believe, than President Obama. And once that happens, then Canada probably and other countries will follow suit. So Putin has very limited time left to achieve his Ukraine objectives. Whether he can achieve them at all is another question. But he may be reliant again, as he was prior to 2010, on the Ukrainians themselves not really following through and dealing with and decapitating pro-Russian clans inside Ukraine. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for that very comprehensive tour d'horizon, as it were. I guess let me kick it off a little bit, and then we'll just open it up for discussion. You know, you talked about these pro-Russian oligarchs as being the potential raw material for some kind of a counter-revolution. And having not been to Ukraine in a while, I was curious if you could talk about the public opinion, how what elements within society would be mobilized for that kind of a counter-revolution, and how much of the revolutionary enthusiasm that you saw in late 2013, 2014 is still there, or how much has that started to shift towards the frustration that ultimately undermined the Orange Coalition?
Well, we've come up to, next month is the second anniversary of the Euromaidan. So it's the equivalent of the end of 2006, after the Orange Revolution. Poroshenko's missed the boat. He should have imposed his political will as soon as he came to power, and in a similar way to Putin in July of 2000, and said, we have a new situation. It's no longer business as usual. And he's not done that. And now it's even more difficult today than it would have been in the early part of just after the revolution. So inevitably, the honeymoon period's gone, the 100 days is gone, the ability to tell the oligarchs that it's no longer business as usual, I think, is more difficult. And there are going to be growing frustration, especially because these are not real political parties. So people withdraw their support for these parties. It's sort of ad hoc. It's not, they're not voting for them for nationalistic or other reasons. So hence Poroshenko's support has dropped very, very low, relatively low. And Yatsenyuk's popularity, his party, which is a completely virtual party, created prior to the elections of last year, is now at 1%. So that frustration will grow. Now, the difference today between now and the Orange Revolution era is that you have a new set of boys in town. In 2006 to 2010, the only sort of counter-revolution would have come from Yanukovych and the party regents. They were supposed to have gone to jail in 2005. They didn't. Yushchenko did a deal with them in September of 2005, brought Yanukovych out of kind of limbo. And it's mind-boggling that in 2010, during the elections, Yushchenko supported Yanukovych over Tymoshenko. You need a psychologist to understand that, not a political scientist. But today you have a second group. You have the nationalist group, which you didn't have then. You have weapons in the country, a lot of weapons. And not surprisingly, you have weapons. When you joined volunteer battalions last year, volunteers had to buy their own equipment or borrow or from friends or somehow raise the money. We're talking $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 each. That's a lot of money for Ukrainians. Now, if you're buying your own weapons and equipment, that weapon belongs to you, not to the government. You're not going to give it to the government when you become a member of the National Guard or military. You're going to hide it away somewhere. You never know where it comes handy. So that is a second group that's potentially around, which wasn't around then. You see, I don't think these groups portray themselves as pro-Russian. Yanukovych in 2010 didn't sort of portray himself as a counter-revolutionary pro-Russian group. And many people in this town, including ex-ambassadors to Ukraine, were all saying, he's a different man, he's changed. I never believed it, but I was in the minority. 4 years later, I was the one saying to them, I told you so. He's the same mafia gangster as he was always. But you wanted to believe he'd changed in 2010, that he was a different person. And so these people who I recognize who they are going to also try to do PR spin, hire people on K Street, hire people in Brussels, and portray themselves differently. Firtash is already doing that in a fantastic way in Austria. The Austrians seem to think that Firtash is the leader of the opposition in Ukraine and the person who funded the Euromaidan revolution. So it's portrayal, how are they portrayed? It's also linked to the fact that because there are no real political parties in Ukraine, political parties are funded by oligarchs, so oligarchs will always create election projects. There's already one in this election created by Kolomoisky. Oligarchs, I mean, I call them pro-Russian. They're not pro-Russian in that sense. Oligarchs are pro-oligarchs.
Right.
They're pro-themselves. And so they loved the old world, the pre-Putin or early Putin-Yeltsin era, where they could milk both sides, the West and the East. The problem came for them when both the West, the EU, and Russia said, make a decision. Where are you going, this way or that way? And that was what created the tension. So their ability to continue funding election projects, which Ukrainians will vote for on a one-off occasion, then withdraw their election, that's where the danger, I think, is. I don't think that there's, we're not going to have a mass another revolution in the sort of year or so ahead. These take time to develop. It took 10 years for the Euromaidan to happen after the Orange Revolution. But we also have a very different situation, a worse situation than after the Orange Revolution. After the Orange Revolution, Ukraine was growing very high. It was very high growth until the 2008 crash. But now Ukraine inherited a bankrupt country. So that, doing reforms in 2005, which Yushchenko should have done, would have been a lot easier than doing reforms today. But Ukraine's been putting off these reforms, and the reason it's been putting off the reforms is because the elites prefer what a World Bank expert calls partial reform equilibrium, where they like to live in this netherland in between both systems, between the old Soviet and the Western system, because that's where they can make most of their corrupt gains. So the dangers are there, but the way they will come to fruition is unclear. I just hope people have more open eyes in this city than they had in 2010 about Yanukovych.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about living between the two systems, you can steal in one and then have the institutions of the other protect your
and hold summits in Yalta or now in Kiev saying, I'm for European integration.
Right. Well, since we are in Washington, and I hope you're going to be meeting with people on the Hill and the administration while you're here, but what would your message for them be? I mean, what would you tell the government here that they should be doing given the epic scale of the mess that they're confronting in Ukraine?
Well, I'm not concerned about democratization as such in Ukraine, because I think that Ukrainians can do that. Ukraine is a plural society. There's quite active civil society, media to some extent. But I think the Western message has to be far, far tougher on the issues of corruption and rule of law. I think it's a complete waste of money pouring millions more into Prosecutor General's office reform. That frustration is already there, as we saw in the speech by the US ambassador a week ago in Odessa. There need to be people who go to jail. Simple as that. I mean, I sound like a sadist every time I say that, but there need to be heads that roll. You can't expect Ukrainians to accept that they have to suffer massive utility price increases, economic, fiscal, and other tough reforms, which are long needed in the country. At the same time, the elites continue to live as though it's business as usual. So I think that has to be probably the big tough message that we have to send. And to what degree that is being sent, I don't know. The Americans probably are sending it the toughest of all the Western countries, because I don't think the West Europeans are such a bunch of hypocrites on this, because many of the countries in Western Europe make so much money from this. I mean, how can the British or the Cypriots tell the Ukrainians to fight corruption? How? So, I mean, but it's those two key areas which Ukraine will fail on. I'll just add a small caveat here. I'm half Italian. My mother's Italian. Not many people kind of know that aspect of me. And so I know southern Italy very well. If you ever think the Ukrainians, and I don't think just Ukrainians, Slavs, maybe Eastern Slavs in general, are going to become like Northern European Anglo-Saxons, you're living, I think, in a dream world. The best we can hope for is Ukrainians becoming like Southern Europeans. There's a cultural aspect to corruption that we shouldn't ignore. There is a reason why Quebec is the most corrupt province of Canada. And, just drive from Toronto to Quebec, you know when you're in Quebec when you cross over the boundary, the provincial boundary, because the roads are terrible. Because there's some corrupt dealings with the transportation. So there is that aspect to it. And there is a reason why Sweden's the least corrupt country in the world.
Because it's full of Swedes.
Ukrainians are not going to become Swedes. They may become Italians, Greeks, Spaniards, which would be great in the European Union, but maybe not so great these days. But so there is an aspect. But where Italy, of course, gains, it has a northern part, which is different.
All right. Well, I think we have time for some questions, so let's open it up. Yeah, please. Wait for the microphone. Please identify yourself, and please end your statement with a question mark.
My name is honeymoon. That's why I decided I have to answer. Thank you for the interview. And I texted my husband and said, Anders, you are not clear on what to do with the oligarchs. So, although I must say I was with you until October 5th when I read immediately the article that was published on the website of the Atlantic Council, and it's called How to Fight Corruption in Ukraine. All over the internet, and actually for me it became clear. I said, be clear. So the answer is the following. Of course, you are perfectly right on all your points, and I admire your presentation, enjoyed everything to do with the cultural part.
Well, he is a Swede. So I gave him a compliment.
There is another thing about that too, because Sweden was extremely corrupt until they opened up all their state laws and all the tax records. But that's another story. So speaking about oligarchs, oligarchs are not supermen. They are only oligarchs as long as they hold gas pipes, state enterprises, and all the rich men, the richest men, have become the richest due to gas. And gas have fuel. Yeah, you know that. So, and what to do is to open the market, to take away the privileges of the oligarchs, and they will disappear. If you go
They won't
to-
disappear.
If you go to Newport, Rhode Island, and look at all those mansions, where are all the Vanderbilts? Nowhere. There was a family reunion, not one of them is even a million. So, although I agree with you, of course, heads and everything, but beware of one thing. I am from austerity. And this is what Putin did. He's jailed for their policy. Heads roll. Chubai said oligarchs are now nanogarchs, right? And where we are, do we want Ukraine to be there? And Ukraine may become the next Russia. So I'm very
Okay.
happy that Russians didn't take this chance.
Do you want to collect a few, or do you want to?
Okay,
can
so
answer if you want.
yeah, so let's just sort of take that. The danger of going against the oligarchs, having that become a landing strip for moving towards a more authoritarian system.
Well, I don't think an authoritarian system is possible in Ukraine. I know it sounds kind of very cultural again, but just because of the regional pluralism, the inability, authoritarianism in Eurasia requires nationalism, whether it's Uzbek or Russia or elsewhere, or Azerbaijan. It requires some kind of state nationalism, and in Ukraine that is not going to work. Even though the volunteer battalions did a lot of fighting and they're very popular in popular culture, nationalist parties get very low support in elections in Ukraine, ethnic nationalist parties. And I just don't see Poroshenko as some kind of nationalist authoritarian. But Anders Aslund is one of the few has always been one of the few writing about Ukrainian economics. I've read all of his books. So he's out there by himself, as it were, writing out them. But when you ask Anders, and this is not just Anders, it's a broader question, what to do about the oligarchs? Should you, for example, and I've asked Anders this question, should you renationalize their assets? And he says always no. Well, how do you defang them? You say that you'll change the system, they can no longer be corrupt. That means they can no longer steal from now onwards, but they'll still keep what they've stolen. So they'll still be big power brokers in the country. And when you have a massive shadow economy, when you have no political parties, they can still, and they have money abroad, which is in EU countries and offshore zones, they can bring in millions to fund election projects still. And so that's one question. How do you renationalize them? When Tymoshenko talked about the question of renationalization in 2005, there was a Western outcry against Tymoshenko. She's a populist, she's crazy, etc., etc. So I don't know what's the answer. The second problem related to this is, and I was on a USAID project in May, June in Ukraine, is the question of oligarchic control of TVs. Very, very important. Yes, Putin did, in a very brutal way, took it over the state control and Gazprom, etc. But how do you take those TV channels off the oligarchs? And if you don't, they, in many ways, control the political process, particularly during election time. And they mobilize populism against the government. I mean, because now Kolomoisky is not on good terms with Poroshenko, his channels attack the government all the time on reforms. So, two questions: renationalization, do you or do you not, of their business assets, and what to do about their television channels. I see no answers anywhere.
Election campaign is financed by the
Yeah, sure.
no TV.
Shadow economy is minute, and there's, I guess, no unofficial financing of political, and they have real political parties. So it's different.
Okay, let's go here.
Thank you. My name is Michael Armeo. I run a small international economic and investment research shop. And I appreciated your presentation in that it was fair in terms of your indictments of both internal and external parties. That said, I'm also Sicilian, so can understand your other comments.
One of my favorite parts of Italy, and I'm not saying that, just I know it very well.
So I appreciated your final comments in that regard. Taking into consideration the reality on the ground, points you made about the oligarchs and the partial equilibrium reform that's being tolerated, if you will, what advice, if any, would you give foreign investors contemplating a move into Ukraine, either on the sovereign debt side or from an equity investment within the public markets? Thank you.
This is above my pay grade. I did economics as my first degree many, many years ago. But I don't think we talked about sovereign debt and things in my economics degree. So I really would, I mean, if I was going to give a general advice, I wouldn't invest in Ukraine. I know friends, including American Ukrainians, who have lost millions in Ukraine. And that was in the Orange Revolution period. Until you clear up the rule of law issue, which is a massive job, you know, what do you do with the judges? What do you do with all these policemen? In the Ministry of Interior? You're creating a new police force, but you have the old militia. What do you do with 20,000 prosecutors? Until you deal with that issue, you know, I don't think your investment's ever going to be completely safe. You can go home for the summer, come back, and you find out you're no longer the head of this company. There are success stories, of course, but there are also very big scare stories. I mean, in the areas you're talking about, again, I'm not really an expert in those areas. I wouldn't really want to touch. But on the more broader foreign investment, I think it's still very shady, very unclear. And it's always a problem if you're, I think, a middle-level investor. If you're a big investor like Coca-Cola, you can always just ring up the ambassador. And then he rings up the president. You're unlikely to be touched. If you're a small investor, again, you can be under the radar. I know a Canadian Ukrainian who runs pizza joints in Kiev. He's not touched. He's just too small. He's small fry for the Donetsk guys. But if you're a medium guy, that's where the danger is.
Okay.
The name is Bogdan Krichkov from Toronto. I liked your comprehensive review. It's historical and political. The question I'd like to pose is there any possibility, and this is the worst case scenario, of the Donbass the rebels gaining political power through parliament to the point where they're very influential or they assume some veto power over foreign policy. In that way, they will be the direct line from Moscow, from Russia to Ukraine, influencing it. So that's the worst case scenario. And it might come through pressure from the West Europeans to make a deal.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question in the sense of, many West Ukrainians would say Ukraine would be better off without the Crimea and Donbass. Ukrainians never fought for the Crimea, and there is still no nationalist or partisan movement in the Crimea. They fought for the Donbass, but not for the Crimea. And the reason why the Ukrainian parliament, for the first time in its history, has a pro-European constitutional majority is because the pro-Russian voters didn't vote in elections, so they're not really represented in that Ukrainian parliament. The problem that the Donbass also has is that there isn't one Donbass. There's two. There's a pro-Ukrainian and a pro-Russian Donbass. I've traveled to the pro-Ukrainian part, the western parts, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and the southern part. I was in Mariupol in April, and the front line there. It's pro-Ukrainian. It didn't support the separatists. So the separatist control is in the eastern Donetsk and southeastern Luhansk. Northern Luhansk is pro-Ukrainian. So again, how do you organize a kind of a return to one single entity? How do you organize elections when you have 40,000 separatist forces, highly trained now? These are not the separatists of last year, which were ragtag volunteers. These are now professionally trained army controlled by Russian officers. How do you disband those? How do you make sure they don't, we're talking about how do you prevent oligarchs influencing elections? How do you prevent these armed separatists influencing elections in a region of the country where there are always goons? And many of the goons who used to be the vigilantes are now the separatists, like the Oplot vigilantes from Kharkiv. Zakharchenko, leader of the Donetsk Republic, is an Oplot vigilante from Kharkiv. So how do you deal with that? And how do you deal with an issue that the Ukrainians have brought up? Can you allow people who have blood on their hands, who have committed war crimes, like various leaders of battalions, how do you allow them to participate in elections? So there are many, many, I think, questions still to be resolved in this. I mean, one gets the impression, you brought up the West Europeans, the West Europeans would love to sort of tidy this up and then go on to another question. I mean, that's what they love. They have so many other headaches, Greece, migrants, you name it, that they would just love the Ukrainian problem to go away. And that's, I think, the danger. Because in many ways, there are many people inside Western Europe, particularly in Greece, Italy, Germany, the big industrial lobby, in France to some degree, who would love it to go back to pre-2014 business as usual with Russia. So, I mean, I think that's the other danger. But reintegrating these regions, and who's going to pay for it all as well? I mean, do you know how much we're talking about? Putin always didn't want, one of the reasons he didn't want to take the Donbass to Russia is that the cost of rebuilding the Donbass is going to be astronomical. Where's this money going to come from? So I think there's more questions than answers to your question as to how do you deal with that area. I mean, it seems like the Donbass is now a region that nobody wants, neither Russia or Ukraine. So stuck in this area. And and those kind of areas sadly become criminalized black holes, like Transnistria at the end.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, you already, okay.
My name is Hilola Suleimanova. I'm from Uzbekistan. And
Sorry, where are you from?
Uzbekistan.
Oh,
yeah, I've recently
I
been
shouldn't have mentioned Uzbekistan then.
Yeah, I've recently been to Ukraine, by the way. So my question is Ukraine able to stop Putin at Donbass border, or Putin will continue his aggressive destabilization of Ukraine politics in Ukraine, of situation?
Well, I mentioned that the Russian intelligence services have continued to train terrorists. One aspect of the war that has not received much publicity at all, I had an article in Foreign Affairs about this about 6 months ago, but it's hardly been covered in the Western media, is this Russian terrorist campaign outside the Donbass in other parts of Ukraine. There have been terrorists captured in most of the regions of Ukraine. The SBU has become better at that. The Ukrainian Security Service they're not good at capturing corrupt officials, but they are good at capturing Russians. and people trained. So the Russians are going to continue that. They're going to continue to play hardball on debt, on energy, on those issues. And they're going to continue to try to buy off agents of influence in these clans, groups, and such like, whether it's the gas lobby, whether it's Akhmetov and co. I mean, the two most dangerous groups in Ukraine, if you want to call it that, are the groups that are not on the wanted list in Interpol. That's Akhmetov and the Donetsk, his people. He's not on that list. And the gas lobby people, they're not on that list either. So down the road, what are they going to be doing? The opposition bloc, the so-called opposition bloc in the Ukrainian parliament, is funded by the gas lobby and Akhmetov. And for them, they want the Donbass to be reintegrated because that's their voters, and they can maybe get a bigger presence in parliament. What they're going to be fighting against is the fact that the pro-Russian political parties disintegrated after the Euromaidan. The Party of Regions is not coming back, and the Communist Party is not coming back. It's finished. Because the Euromaidan revolution was many things. It was both a pro-democracy, pro-European movement, but also an anti-communist, anti-Soviet movement, which again hasn't received much publicity in the West. There have been 600 monuments of Vladimir Lenin pulled down since the Euromaidan. 600. Still many to go. The Soviet Union must have spent a fortune on these monuments. But it's, they're protected and defended in Putin's Russia and in the separatist republics, and they're pulled down in Ukraine. There, again, I can show you the civilization conflict between the two. But yes, I mean, Putin will continue. I mean, he'll always have many tracks. He'll do the Syrian thing, he'll calm down the separatists, but he'll do other destabilization efforts. He's not going to pull back completely.
Hello, my name is Georgi. I'm from Georgia, Johns Hopkins. We Georgia, first of all, thank you very much for a very nice presentation, for very interesting information. And we Georgians, we support Ukraine very much. We think that this is our front as well. If Ukraine will be successful, Georgia will be successful as well. And we see that there are two reforms, one of two main subjects, two main fronts. One is, of course, conflict with Russia. The second one is fighting against corruption in Ukraine, because both of them are, we believe that it's the equal. So do you think that, I mean, for fighting of corruption, you need, it's quite painful. You have to fire a lot, as you mentioned, and it's quite, these people becomes actually your potential opposition, etc. So usually we did in Georgia these reforms against the corruption when we had quite big ranking of the ruling party. I mean, when you got the huge support from the people. So do you think that the Ukraine missed that moment again, when they had the chance, when they had the huge support from the people, and when exactly you can do this painful, let's say, reforms? And second, do you think that the crisis in Ukraine is happening because there was no enough attention from the West when there was the occupation of Georgia? Thank you.
I'll do the first part. The second part is easy to answer because, of course, yes. I mean, the Russians got away with Georgia 2008, and they thought they could get away with Crimea. They really misread Western governments. The Western government sent completely the wrong signals after Georgia 2008. And now various scholars are saying this. Fiona Hill and others are saying this. But they're kind of saying it with hindsight. 2009, Obama started a reset of relations with Russia just after they invaded Georgia. I mean, Putin already in Bucharest told President Bush, Ukraine is not a country. That southern and eastern Ukraine belong to us. He already said this to Bush in 2008. So this is 6 years before he began his new Russia project. So of course, the West was under the illusions that they didn't want to listen to what Putin was saying. We're saying, we don't want to be part of you. Get away. We're a separate civilization. We're Eurasia. We're not European. We're not Asian. Leave us alone. And the West was saying, no, come on, keep with us. Keep in the G7. You're going to be part of like us. And I think this misnomer just continued until it finally dawned on them in 2013 on the West that Putin was actually meaning what he said. But the first signal of that again, is brought out in these various books I've been mentioning, was Putin's speech to the Munich Security Conference as early as 2007. But Putin already began, prior to the Euromaidan, he began his kind of anti-xenophobic, anti-Western kind of counter-revolution in 2012, because he really believed, and these guys sincerely believed, that these protesters in Moscow and in Ukraine are all financed by the West. This is the conspiracy theory going back in Russian history to way back. I have books from 1918 where Russian writers talk about Ukrainians as a conspiracy dreamt up by the Austrians. This has very deep roots in Russian culture. There's nothing new. They had it in the Soviet Union. Dissidents were not real political actors. They were financed by Zionists from the West, by the CIA, by emigres. So this has deep roots in the culture. Putin believed that in 2012, switched to conservative values, anti-Western xenophobia, started relying on Russian emigre fascist and nationalist scholars. We continue to ignore that. The House of Lords, the British House of Lords, did a very good report into the Crimea where they said the EU sleepwalked into this crisis, completely ignored the Russia. It saw what it, like often diplomats do, I'm sorry to say. They see what they want to see. They don't see what I see. In 2010, I saw Yanukovych for what he was, a mafia thug, mafioso thug. They didn't want to see that. They saw it in 2014. They didn't see it in 2012. So that explains the complete Western misunderstanding and miscalculation of Putin and those. On the domestic side, is an interesting aspect to this, Georgia, which people don't realize. I don't think watchers of Ukraine don't realize. There are 16 Georgians in the Ukrainian government. You have two government in exiles in that region. The Yanukovych government in exile in Russia and the Georgian government in exile in Ukraine. Saakashvili obviously is using Ukraine as a stepping stone to go back to power in Georgia. He doesn't want to be prime minister of Ukraine. I think that's completely wrong. He wants to use that as a base to go back to Georgia. And so from that point of view, it's a good thing because he has to show success in Ukraine to then use in his election campaign in Georgia. There's also the reintroduction of the Soviet system. Poroshenko's reintroduced the Soviet system. What was the Soviet system? In each republic, you had an ethnic leader, Uzbek in Uzbekistan, Ukrainian in Ukraine, but the deputy in charge, was always a Russian. He was the guy who controlled things. Putin's reintroduced this in the Crimea now. There are Crimeans in charge, but the deputies in charge are all from Moscow. It's the same system. In Ukraine, the deputy in charge is a Georgian. He's now the controller. Maybe the one really pushing for reforms, like the deputy prosecutor general. So Ukraine's always going to be a mixed picture from that point of view. I happened to be in Odessa as part of this USAID project in, when was it? Early June, when Saakashvili was appointed. It's a weird coincidence. I didn't see, nobody was really opposed to it. They all thought it was good. The locals thought it was good. Is he a populist? Yes, but why is that a problem if he goes publicly himself to places and reveals corruption? That I think is positive, not negative populism in that case. Odessa, though, is one hell of a thing to try and resolve. This has historically always been a very corrupt place, including Tsarist and the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet. And the people in charge of Odessa, whether they're pro-Russian or pro-Western Democrats, they've all been involved in that corruption. This is not just something attached to one group. And so cleaning up that city, which is a port area, which is always a problem, plus it's next to Transnistria, which is a big black hole, that is going to be a big task for Saakashvili. But I guess Saakashvili loves big tasks. Bigger the better. Well, sorry, one big major difference, though. You compared Ukraine and Georgia. One major difference, of course, where you can't really compare Ukraine and Georgia, is that, of course, Saakashvili and Poroshenko are not the same people. The Georgian government, I remember when the Georgian government, the average age was 30. The average age in the Azarov government was 60. most of them didn't speak English in the Azarov government. Everybody spoke English in the Georgian government, and they were all trained in the West. So it's a different group of people in that sense. So I think there the comparison is very different. And also, in terms of conflict, where it's different, is that South Ossetia is so close to Tbilisi, the southern border, whereas the Donbass is so far away from Kiev. You know, Donbass can be let go, and you still have a huge area of Ukraine east of Kiev and west of Donbass. It takes 7 hours. You can't do it now, but it used to take 7 hours to go on the intercity fast train from Kiev to Donetsk. It's a long way. Whereas, you know, South Ossetia to Tbilisi is, what, 50 kilometers? 40. So it's, you know, it's much more of a threat to the survival of Georgia, as it were, than Donbass is not, the Donbass conflict will not impact upon Ukraine to that degree. And this is where I think it's wrong to call the Donbass conflict a frozen conflict. Because in Moldova and Georgia and Azerbaijan, the central governments were defeated by separatists. The central government in Kyiv was not defeated by separatists. In Ukraine, what you have is an unresolved conflict because neither side achieved its objectives. The separatists didn't achieve their objective of taking over the whole of Donbass or taking over the whole, especially the whole of Novorossiya. And the Ukrainians didn't achieve their objective, which they knew were about to do last summer, of winning back territory. So you have an unresolved, unstable, going back to the question earlier, an unresolved and unstable conflict. Whereas the conflicts in Moldova, Georgia, and Azerbaijan are pretty stable for 20 years, because one side won. So I think you can apply the concept of frozen conflict to Crimea, but not to Donbass.
Okay. Yeah, Ed.
I grabbed the mic so that Colin Cleary can ask a question. But in case he doesn't ask the question I want him to ask, I'll come back.
Well, thank you, Ed. Colin Cleary, U.S. Institute of Peace. I was just wondering, Taras, if you'd
Hi,
comment.
Colin.
Good to see you. If you'd comment on the upcoming local elections and whether will offer a verdict on reform or populism, and be interested in your thoughts.
Is that the question you wanted to ask, Ed? No. Okay.
Do you want to add your question, or do you want to?
Well, maybe because it may be related to the local election question. What are Poroshenko's domestic political options after that election? I mean, the parties in power are likely not to do very well, particularly the prime minister's party. Would he, for example, take control of the reform process himself rather than saying that that's what Yatsenuk's supposed to be doing, and take ownership, political ownership over that? Might he do a deal like his president Yushchenko did? I mean, you know, Firtash and Boyko can bring in cheap gas. Again, Lovich can run a more professional government, maybe. So no, somewhere between those two extremes, perhaps. What are his domestic political options?
Well, we have to understand that, you know, if there are no political parties in the country in general, that's even more the case at the local level, where, you know, political parties have some semblance of structure in Kiev. You know, they have an office, they have this and that. But in the regions, there was always very, very weak representation of political parties throughout Ukraine. So this local elections, you're going to have a lot of fake and, you know, virtual election projects created by businessmen in the local areas. I don't think it's going to be a political competition in a true sense of that word at the local level. But at the same time, you're also going to get quite a few, I think, as you did in the national parliament, quite a few civil society activists are going to come in at the local level. Now, that's bad and good because, as you know, people can be corrupted if they're brought into the political process. Civil society activists can be a good guy, and then suddenly when he's in power, he's offered nice benefits. What are Poroshenko's options? It's very difficult for him because what everybody's watching out for that he shouldn't do is return to the Yushchenko-Tymoshenko squabbling. So he can't, in that sense, get rid of Yatsenyuk. Because people will say, they'll just compare it to what happened after with, Yushchenko, Tymoshenko. Yatsenyuk's party is not even standing in these elections, which is, just goes to show you that it was always a fake party. Now, I think Poroshenko will continue to be the largest party. It's a kind of the party of power. It's a party that particularly businessmen gravitate to. And you have the rise of the return of Tymoshenko, who is going to mobilize on a populist campaign against these reforms. She's talking about indexing pensions and wages to inflation, which of course is ridiculous. If you want to bankrupt Ukraine even more. But inevitably in this kind of environment, you're going to have the rise of those populists. What's interesting is that what hasn't grown is that the opposition bloc hasn't grown in popularity. And the ethnic nationalist parties haven't grown that much. I mean, they're about 3%. Svoboda, 1%, right sector is about 3.5%. So what I think you've had is a growth of patriotism, not nationalism in Ukraine. And that's reflected in how Ukrainians relate to Russia. They dislike intensely the Russian government and President Putin, but there isn't this ethnic hostility towards Russians. So it's a patriotism. Ukrainians, in that sense, are like Italians and Greeks who will fight for their country, but not for their government. They dislike intensely, Italians and Greeks intensely dislike Roman Athens, but they're very patriotic for their country. Here, in an Anglo-Saxon world, our soldiers fight for the country and for the way of life, the political system, as it were. It's different because the two things are interconnected. But in places like Southern Europe, they don't. There is a reason why Italians and Greeks prefer to deal with Brussels, not their own central governments. That's why they're more pro-EU. But if you have a country where there's good governance, then there's less need to go to Brussels because you have good governance in London or Stockholm or elsewhere. And so the Ukrainians are like that. And I think that you're not going to see a major reconfiguration, I don't think. The self-reliance, the party of the Lviv mayor has gone up in popularity, which is a good thing. But again, remember, this is a party which is a fan club of the mayor of Lviv. It's not a real party. It's a party geared to helping him stand in future presidential elections. So I don't think there's going to be a major change. The big change, hopefully, will be younger people and civil society activists coming into local councils. And that, coupled with the new policies on decentralization, which are confusing to everybody, including us in the USA team, should empower the people in the regions more. But that's a big question. As we know, it's an explosive issue, particularly when you're dealing with special status, so-called, for Donbass. Poroshenko is going to have to. Poroshenko relied on the opposition bloc for his vote for the law on decentralization. But I don't see how we can get 300. The next vote has to be 300 votes to change the constitution. I don't see how we'll get those votes. It's very difficult. The West European leaders are putting Poroshenko in a difficult position and pressuring him to go down that road when that could undermine his credibility inside the Ukrainian parliament because, Poroshenko can't be seen to be adhering to Russian pressure to create some kind of federal or decentralized or autonomous Donbass. That would be a no-starter in Kiev. So.
All right, we have time. No, okay, I guess we have to wrap up. This has been a really comprehensive overview. I'm glad you guys could stay till the end. Let's join and thank Professor Kuzio.
Thank you.